Part 1. In the late 1930s, the world was still recovering from the devastation of the First World War. Cities had been rebuilt, economies slowly restored, and a fragile peace had settled over Europe. But beneath that fragile calm, tension was growing. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the previous war, left many countries dissatisfied, especially Germany. The nation had lost territory, military power, and international prestige. For many Germans, the treaty symbolized humiliation. Into this unstable environment stepped Adolf Hitler. Rising to power in 1933, he promised to restore Germany's strength, rebuild its military, and reclaim lost lands. Over the next several years, Germany rapidly rearmed. New tanks rolled out of factories. Aircraft filled newly constructed air bases. Soldiers trained in modern tactics designed for speed and overwhelming force. European leaders watched with concern, but many still hoped diplomacy could prevent another war. Some believed Hitler's ambitions were limited. Others feared confrontation more than they feared expansion. As a result, Germany was able to grow stronger with relatively little resistance. By 1939, the situation had reached a breaking point. Hitler demanded control of territories that had once belonged to Germany, but were now part of neighboring countries. One of those countries was Poland. Negotiations failed, tensions escalated, and the German military prepared for invasion. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The attack came at dawn. Columns of tanks pushed forward along major roads, while infantry units advanced behind them. At the same time, aircraft from the German Luftwaffe attacked railways, communication centers, and military positions. The strategy was clear: move fast, break defenses quickly, and prevent the enemy from organizing an effective response. This method of warfare became known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Instead of slow battles along fixed front lines, blitzkrieg relied on speed and coordination. Tanks would break through defensive positions, aircraft would destroy supply routes and reinforcements, and motorized infantry would follow through the gaps. The goal was not simply to defeat the enemy army, but to collapse its entire command structure. Polish forces fought bravely, but they were unprepared for this new style of warfare. Many units still relied on strategies developed during the First World War. Communication was slower, mobility was limited, and air support was weaker. As German armored divisions pushed deeper into the country, Polish defenses began to crumble. Cities were bombed, roads filled with refugees fleeing the fighting. Military units attempted to regroup, but German forces moved faster than expected. Within days, key positions had been lost. Entire formations were surrounded and forced to surrender. On September 3rd, 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France declared war on Germany. They had pledged to protect Poland's independence, and now they were bound by that promise. What had started as a regional invasion was suddenly transforming into a global conflict. Yet despite the declarations of war, there was little immediate fighting in Western Europe. British and French armies mobilized along the German border, but did not launch a major offensive. Many leaders still hoped the war might end through negotiation or limited conflict. This strange period would later be known as the Phony War. Meanwhile, Poland faced another disaster. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. A secret agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union had divided Poland between them. Now Polish forces were trapped between two powerful armies advancing from opposite directions. Under this enormous pressure, resistance became impossible to sustain. Polish units continued to fight in scattered battles, but the overall outcome was already clear. By early October 1939, Poland had been defeated and divided. The speed of the campaign shocked the world. In just a few weeks, Germany had destroyed the defenses of an entire nation. Military leaders everywhere began studying the tactics used during the invasion. Blitzkrieg had demonstrated that modern war would be faster, more mobile, and far more destructive than many had expected. But for Hitler and the German command, Poland was only the first step. Plans were already being developed for new campaigns. Their next targets lay to the west: Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. If those countries could be defeated quickly, Germany would control most of Europe. Across the continent, civilians listened to news broadcasts with growing fear. Factories began shifting to wartime production. Governments prepared their armies. Young men were drafted into military service. The world had entered a new and uncertain era. Few people yet understood how large the coming conflict would become. But one thing was clear: the peace that had existed since the end of the First World War was gone. A second, far more devastating war had begun. Part 2. During the months after the fall of Poland, Europe entered a strange and uneasy phase of the war. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, yet very little fighting occurred along the Western Front. Soldiers dug defensive positions, patrols watched the borders, and both sides prepared for the next stage of the conflict. Newspapers called it a war, but for many civilians it still felt distant and uncertain. Historians would later refer to this quiet period as the phony war. Behind the scenes, however, massive preparations were underway. Germany was not planning to wait. Hitler and his generals knew that if Britain and France fully mobilized their enormous industrial resources, Germany would eventually face overwhelming opposition. The German strategy was simple: strike quickly, defeat Western Europe before it could organize, and secure control of the continent. The first targets were the small countries that lay between Germany and France. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had tried to remain neutral, hoping to avoid becoming battlefields. But geography made neutrality almost impossible. To reach France effectively, German forces would have to pass through these territories. On May 10, 1940, the attack began. German aircraft appeared over Dutch airfields before sunrise, bombing runways and military installations. Paratroopers dropped from the sky to capture bridges and key defensive positions. At the same time, armored divisions crossed the borders, pushing rapidly into the Netherlands and Belgium. The speed of the attack shocked the defenders. German forces combined tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry in carefully coordinated movements. Communication between units allowed them to respond quickly to changing conditions on the battlefield. Where resistance appeared strongest, they shifted their advance and attacked weaker points. Within only a few days, the Netherlands was overwhelmed. After the devastating bombing of Rotterdam, which destroyed large sections of the city and killed many civilians, the Dutch government surrendered. Belgium continued fighting, but the pressure on its army increased every day. Meanwhile, the main German attack was unfolding farther south in a region that Allied commanders believed was safe: the Ardennes Forest. This area was dense, rugged, and considered difficult terrain for large armored formations. Because of this assumption, the French had placed relatively weak defenses there. German commanders saw the opportunity. Massive columns of tanks and vehicles pushed through narrow forest roads, creating long lines that stretched for miles. It was a risky maneuver. If Allied aircraft had detected the columns and attacked, the advance might have been stopped. But the movement went largely unnoticed until it was too late. When the German armored divisions emerged from the Ardennes, they struck directly toward the English Channel. Their objective was not simply to defeat Allied forces in battle, but to trap them. British and French armies that had moved into Belgium to stop the initial attack suddenly found themselves cut off from the south. Within days, the situation became catastrophic for the Allies. German units advanced rapidly toward the coast, surrounding hundreds of thousands of soldiers near the French port city of Dunkirk. If these forces were captured or destroyed, Britain would lose most of its trained army. What followed became one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history. Beginning in late May 1940, the British government organized a desperate rescue operation. Warships, transport vessels, fishing boats, and even small civilian craft crossed the English Channel to evacuate soldiers trapped on the beaches. German forces closed in while aircraft bombed the harbor and surrounding areas. Smoke filled the sky as ships loaded troops under constant threat of attack. Yet despite the danger, the evacuation continued for days. In the end, more than 300,000 Allied soldiers were rescued and transported back to Britain. Although they had lost much of their equipment, the survival of these troops allowed Britain to continue the war. For France, however, the situation was far worse. German armies continued pushing deeper into the country. Defensive lines collapsed, cities were abandoned, and refugees flooded the roads. The French military, once considered one of the strongest in Europe, struggled to respond to the speed and coordination of the German advance. By June 1940, German forces had reached Paris. The French government declared the city an open city to avoid destruction, and German troops marched through the capital without major resistance. Shortly afterward, France signed an armistice with Germany. The country was divided. Northern France and the Atlantic coast came under direct German occupation, while a new government was established in the south under strict German influence. In just 6 weeks, Germany had defeated the combined forces of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Most of Western Europe was now under German control, but one nation still refused to surrender. Across the English Channel, Britain prepared to fight on alone. Part 3. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled most of Western Europe. Poland had fallen, France had surrendered, Belgium and the Netherlands were occupied. Only one major power in Western Europe remained outside German control: Great Britain. Across the English Channel, Britain faced a dangerous and uncertain future. The British Army had escaped from Dunkirk, but it had left behind enormous amounts of equipment: tanks, artillery, vehicles, and ammunition. The country was vulnerable. If Germany managed to invade the island, there was no guarantee Britain could stop it. Adolf Hitler believed that Britain might still agree to negotiate peace. He expected that the British government would see the situation as hopeless and choose compromise rather than continued war. But the newly appointed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had a different vision. In speeches broadcast across the nation, Churchill made Britain's position clear. The country would continue fighting, no matter how difficult the struggle became. One of his most famous statements echoed across radios throughout the country. Britain would never surrender. For Germany, this meant that a new strategy was necessary. In order to invade Britain, the German military first needed control of the skies above the English Channel and southern England. Without air superiority, any invasion fleet would be extremely vulnerable to attack. The coming battle would be fought largely in the air. The German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, was one of the most powerful in the world. It had played a crucial role in the rapid victories across Europe. Its bombers and fighters had supported blitzkrieg operations and destroyed enemy defenses with speed and precision. Facing them was the Royal Air Force, or RAF. The British Fighter Command had fewer aircraft and fewer pilots than the Germans, but it possessed two key advantages: an advanced radar warning system and highly maneuverable fighter planes, including the famous Spitfire and Hurricane. Radar stations along the British coast allowed defenders to detect incoming German aircraft before they reached the mainland. This meant British fighters could take off at exactly the right moment and intercept enemy formations in the air. The first phase of the Battle of Britain began in July 1940. German aircraft targeted shipping in the English Channel and coastal installations. Soon the attacks expanded to include radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. Day after day, waves of German bombers crossed the Channel, escorted by fighter aircraft. British fighters rose to meet them, and intense dogfights filled the skies. Pilots from both sides pushed their aircraft to the limits of speed and maneuverability. The battles were brutal and exhausting. Pilots often flew multiple missions per day. Aircraft returned to bases riddled with bullet holes. Some did not return at all. Despite the heavy pressure, the RAF managed to hold its ground. British radar stations continued to provide early warnings, allowing fighter squadrons to intercept incoming raids before they could reach critical targets. In September 1940, the German strategy shifted. Instead of focusing primarily on airfields and military targets, the Luftwaffe began bombing major British cities. London became the main target. Night after night, waves of bombers attacked the city. Fires spread across entire districts as buildings were destroyed. Civilians took shelter in underground subway stations and basements, while explosions echoed above. This period became known as the Blitz. Yet instead of breaking British morale, the bombings strengthened public determination. Civilians continued working in factories. Emergency crews fought fires and rescued survivors from collapsed buildings. Life continued despite the constant threat from the sky. Meanwhile, the RAF continued defending the airspace over Britain. German bombers suffered increasing losses. Fighter escorts struggled to protect them over long distances. Gradually, it became clear that Germany had failed to achieve air superiority. Without control of the skies, a full-scale invasion of Britain became far too dangerous. German leaders postponed the invasion plans indefinitely. The Battle of Britain became the first major defeat for Nazi Germany during the war. It proved that the German war machine could be resisted and even stopped. For the British people, the victory was more than a military success. It was proof that the war was not lost. But the conflict was far from over. Across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, other nations were moving toward a war that would soon engulf the entire world. Part 4. By 1941, the war in Europe had already reshaped the continent. Germany controlled vast territories stretching from France to Poland. Britain stood alone in the West, continuing the fight despite constant bombing and the threat of invasion. But Adolf Hitler was already planning the next and most ambitious stage of his campaign. His new objective lay to the east. Despite having signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, Hitler never intended that agreement to last. Nazi ideology viewed the Soviet Union as both a political and racial enemy. German leadership believed that conquering the eastern territories would provide vast resources, farmland, and strategic dominance. The operation was given the name Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, the largest land invasion in history began. At dawn, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a massive front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. Thousands of tanks advanced across open fields, while artillery thundered and aircraft attacked Soviet airfields and supply lines. The initial assault was devastating. Many Soviet units were caught completely unprepared. German aircraft destroyed hundreds of planes on the ground before they could even take off. Armored divisions pushed rapidly forward, surrounding large groups of Soviet troops and cutting off their escape routes. Entire Soviet armies were trapped in enormous encirclements. In the early months of the invasion, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. Cities fell one after another as German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory. The German military believed the campaign would end quickly. Many commanders expected the Soviet Union to collapse within a few months. Their strategy was simple: destroy the Red Army near the border, capture major cities, and force the Soviet government to surrender before winter. At first, events seemed to support this belief. German forces captured large areas of Ukraine and Belarus. Smolensk fell after fierce fighting. The road toward Moscow appeared open. In the north, German armies advanced toward Leningrad. In the south, they pushed toward the industrial and agricultural centers that were vital to the Soviet economy. But the Soviet Union was far larger and more resilient than German planners had anticipated. As the Red Army retreated, it adopted a strategy of scorched earth. Infrastructure was destroyed. Bridges were blown up. Crops and supplies were burned to prevent them from falling into German hands. The deeper German forces advanced, the longer and more fragile their supply lines became. Meanwhile, Soviet factories were dismantled and transported eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. There they began producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons at an astonishing pace. The Soviet leadership was determined to continue the war regardless of the cost. The German advance slowed as autumn approached. Heavy rains turned roads into deep mud, making movement difficult for tanks and supply vehicles. This period became known as the Rasputitsa, the season when the landscape itself seemed to fight against armies. Despite these difficulties, German forces continued pushing toward their ultimate objective, Moscow. By late autumn 1941, German units were approaching the outskirts of the Soviet capital. From certain positions, soldiers could reportedly see the distant skyline of the city. The Soviet government prepared for the possibility that Moscow might fall. But winter arrived. The German army had expected the campaign to end before the cold season began. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Vehicles struggled to start in freezing temperatures. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold. At the same time, fresh Soviet divisions began arriving from Siberia. These troops were trained and equipped for winter warfare. In December 1941, the Red Army launched a powerful counteroffensive. German forces, exhausted and poorly prepared for the harsh conditions, were pushed back from the outskirts of Moscow. The rapid German advance that had begun 6 months earlier had finally been stopped. Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its main objective. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for years and would become the largest and most brutal theater of the entire conflict. Millions of soldiers would fight across enormous distances in battles of staggering scale. But even as the war raged in Europe, events were about to unfold on the other side of the world that would transform the conflict into a truly global war. Part 5. While the war in Europe was growing larger and more brutal, tensions were also rising across the Pacific. Japan had spent the 1930s expanding its empire throughout East Asia. Its military leaders believed that control over neighboring territories would provide the resources needed to strengthen the nation and secure its future. Japan had already invaded large parts of China and fought a long, costly war there. However, the Japanese Empire still depended heavily on imported resources, especially oil and steel. Many of these supplies came from the United States and other Western nations. As Japanese expansion continued, relations with the United States grew increasingly tense. American leaders viewed Japan's military actions with deep concern and began placing economic restrictions on the country. Eventually, the United States imposed a major oil embargo, cutting off one of Japan's most critical sources of fuel. For Japan's military leadership, this created a dangerous situation. Without access to oil, the empire's navy and air force would eventually become powerless. Japanese commanders concluded that if war with the United States was unavoidable, it would be better to strike first. Their target would be the American Pacific Fleet. The fleet was stationed at Pearl Harbor, a major naval base on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Japanese planners believed that if they could destroy the fleet in a sudden surprise attack, the United States would be unable to interfere with Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The plan required secrecy, precision, and perfect timing. On December 7, 1941, a Japanese carrier fleet approached Hawaii undetected. Hundreds of aircraft were launched from the decks of 6 aircraft carriers and flew toward Pearl Harbor early in the morning. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft began its attack. Torpedo bombers swept low across the harbor, targeting battleships anchored in neat rows along the shoreline. Dive bombers attacked airfields and military installations, while fighter aircraft strafed planes parked on runways. The American forces at Pearl Harbor were completely surprised. Within minutes, explosions and fires spread across the base. Battleships were hit by torpedoes and bombs. One of the most dramatic moments came when the battleship USS Arizona suffered a massive explosion after a bomb ignited its ammunition magazines. The ship sank rapidly, taking more than 1,000 sailors with it. Aircraft parked wing to wing on the airfields became easy targets. Many were destroyed before they could even take off. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but the damage was enormous. 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. Yet despite the devastation, the Japanese attack had failed to destroy several key targets. American aircraft carriers were not present at the harbor that morning. Fuel storage facilities and repair docks also remained intact. These surviving resources would soon become critically important. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the United States Congress. In a speech that would become famous, he described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies in the Axis alliance, declared war on the United States as well. The conflict that had begun in Europe only 2 years earlier was now fully global. American industry rapidly mobilized for war. Factories that once produced automobiles and household goods began building tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons. Millions of men and women joined the armed forces or took jobs supporting the war effort. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces launched rapid offensives against British, Dutch, and American territories. In the early months of 1942, they captured vast areas, including the Philippines, Singapore, and large portions of Southeast Asia. At first, the Japanese Empire appeared unstoppable, but the United States and its allies were already preparing their response. Massive shipbuilding programs began. New aircraft rolled off production lines. Military commanders started planning the long and difficult campaign that would eventually push Japanese forces back across the Pacific. The war had now spread across 2 vast oceans and multiple continents. The largest conflict in human history had truly begun. Part 6. By 1942, the war had expanded across nearly every major region of the world. Massive battles were taking place in North Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean, in the Pacific Islands, and along the vast front lines of the Soviet Union. Among all these theaters of war, the Eastern Front had become the largest and most brutal battlefield in human history. German forces continued pushing deep into Soviet territory during the summer of 1942. Hitler ordered a new major offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was essential for tanks, aircraft, and vehicles, and Germany desperately needed more fuel to sustain its growing military operations. As part of this strategy, German armies moved toward a city on the banks of the Volga River, Stalingrad. At first glance, the city seemed valuable, mainly because of its location. It was a major industrial center and an important transportation hub connecting southern Russia with other parts of the Soviet Union. But the city also carried enormous symbolic importance. It bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Hitler believed that capturing Stalingrad would deliver a powerful political and psychological blow to the Soviet Union. German forces reached the outskirts of the city in August 1942. The Luftwaffe launched massive bombing raids that destroyed large portions of the city. Buildings collapsed, streets filled with rubble, and fires burned across entire districts. Thousands of civilians were killed during the bombardment. But the destruction of the city did not make it easier to capture. Instead, the ruins created a deadly urban battlefield. Soviet soldiers used shattered buildings, basements, and factories as defensive positions. Snipers hid among the rubble. Small units fought from room to room and floor to floor. The battle for Stalingrad quickly became one of the most intense and brutal struggles of the entire war. German troops expected to capture the city quickly, but the fighting dragged on for weeks and then months. Every block of the city became contested territory. Soldiers described the battle as Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, because combat often took place at extremely close range in destroyed buildings and underground passages. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership prepared a massive counterattack. Instead of focusing directly on the heavily defended city, Soviet commanders targeted the weaker German allies guarding the flanks of the German army. Romanian and Italian units were stationed along these extended front lines and were far less equipped than the German divisions fighting in the city. In November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus. Two enormous Soviet armies attacked from the north and south, smashing through the weaker defensive lines. Within days, the Soviet forces met west of Stalingrad, surrounding the entire German Sixth Army inside the city. More than 250,000 German soldiers were suddenly trapped. Hitler ordered the army to hold its position and promised that supplies would be delivered by air. But the German Air Force could not transport enough food, ammunition, and fuel to sustain such a large force during the harsh Russian winter. As temperatures dropped far below freezing, conditions inside the encirclement became desperate. Soldiers faced starvation, disease, and constant Soviet attacks. Supplies ran out. Vehicles could no longer operate. Many soldiers were wounded or suffering from frostbite. Despite the deteriorating situation, German commanders were forbidden to retreat. By early 1943, the trapped army was exhausted and collapsing. Soviet forces tightened their grip on the city and gradually pushed the remaining German units into smaller pockets of resistance. On February 2, 1943, the last German troops in Stalingrad surrendered. The defeat was catastrophic for Germany. Nearly an entire army had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the most important turning points of the Second World War. For the first time, the German army had suffered a massive strategic defeat. The momentum of the war on the Eastern Front had shifted. From that moment forward, the Soviet Union would begin pushing westward, slowly but relentlessly, driving German forces back across the territories they had conquered. The road to Berlin had begun, and in the West the Allies were preparing for another operation that would open a new front in Europe. Part 7. By 1943, the tide of the war had begun to shift. Germany had suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad, and the Soviet Union was steadily pushing westward across the Eastern Front. In North Africa, Allied forces had driven German and Italian armies out of the region after intense battles across deserts and fortified positions. Meanwhile, the United States had fully mobilized its massive industrial power, producing enormous numbers of ships, aircraft, and weapons. But Western Europe was still under Nazi control. For the Allies, defeating Germany would eventually require a massive invasion of the European continent. Such an operation would be incredibly dangerous. The German military had fortified the Atlantic coastline with bunkers, artillery, minefields, and defensive obstacles designed to stop any landing attempt. The defenses became known as the Atlantic Wall. Planning the invasion required years of preparation. Allied commanders had to assemble enormous numbers of troops, ships, aircraft, and supplies. They also needed to choose the right location for the landing. The most direct route into France was through the Pas-de-Calais region, the narrowest part of the English Channel. Because of this, German commanders believed the invasion would most likely occur there. The Allies used this assumption to their advantage. They launched one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in military history. Fake armies were created using inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and false radio communications. These imaginary forces appeared to be preparing for an invasion at Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence believed the deception and concentrated many defenses in the wrong location. Meanwhile, the real invasion force was preparing to strike farther west along the beaches of Normandy. The operation was given the name Operation Overlord. On the night of June 5, 1944, thousands of ships began crossing the English Channel. Soldiers crowded onto landing craft while aircraft filled the skies above the fleet. Paratroopers prepared to jump behind enemy lines to capture bridges and disrupt German communications. Just after midnight on June 6th, the first airborne units dropped into occupied France. Many landed far from their intended zones due to darkness, clouds, and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Despite the confusion, these soldiers quickly began attacking German positions and securing key routes. At dawn, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. More than 150,000 Allied troops landed along 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach presented different challenges. Some areas had lighter defenses, while others were heavily fortified with bunkers overlooking the shoreline. One of the most intense battles occurred at Omaha Beach. As American landing craft approached the shore, German machine guns and artillery opened fire from cliffs above the beach. Many soldiers were hit before they could even leave their boats. Others struggled through deep water while carrying heavy equipment. For several hours, the situation looked dangerously close to failure. Units were scattered, communications were disrupted, and casualties were extremely high. Yet small groups of soldiers slowly began climbing the cliffs and attacking the German defenses from the sides and rear. Gradually, the defensive positions were neutralized. By the end of the day, Allied forces had secured a foothold in Normandy. Reinforcements, vehicles, and supplies continued arriving across the beaches. Engineers worked quickly to build temporary harbors that allowed large ships to unload cargo directly onto the coast. The invasion marked the opening of the long-awaited Western Front in Europe. Over the following weeks, intense fighting continued across the countryside of Normandy. German forces launched counterattacks, but the growing strength of the Allied armies made it increasingly difficult for them to push the invaders back into the sea. As summer progressed, Allied forces finally broke out of the Normandy region and began advancing across France. Cities were liberated one after another. On August 25, 1944, Paris was freed from German occupation. The war in Europe had entered its final phase. From the west, Allied armies were moving toward Germany. From the east, the Soviet Union was advancing with enormous momentum. The two fronts were slowly closing in on the heart of the Third Reich. And the final battle for Europe was approaching. Part 8. By early 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany had become inevitable. The Allied armies in the West had crossed into German territory after months of fighting through France and Belgium. From the east, the Soviet Red Army had pushed across Poland and was rapidly approaching the German capital. The Third Reich, which had once controlled most of Europe, was now surrounded on nearly every side. German cities were suffering devastating bombing raids. Allied aircraft targeted factories, railways, fuel depots, and military infrastructure. Entire industrial regions were reduced to ruins. Supply lines were broken, production slowed, and transportation across the country became increasingly difficult. Despite the desperate situation, Adolf Hitler refused to consider surrender. German forces were ordered to continue fighting even when defeat was certain. Young boys, elderly men, and poorly trained militia units were mobilized in a last attempt to defend the country. Meanwhile, Soviet forces launched their final massive offensive toward Berlin. In April 1945, the Red Army began its assault on the German capital. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers advanced toward the city, with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. German defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, attempted to resist in the streets, buildings, and underground tunnels of Berlin. The battle quickly became chaotic and destructive. Artillery bombardments shook entire districts while tanks pushed through shattered neighborhoods. Civilians hid in basements as the fighting closed in from every direction. Inside the city, the German leadership was beginning to collapse. Adolf Hitler had retreated into an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. There, surrounded by a small group of loyal officials and military officers, he continued issuing orders that could no longer realistically be carried out. As Soviet troops fought their way through Berlin, it became clear that the end was only days away. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide inside his bunker. Without centralized leadership, Germany's remaining resistance rapidly began to disintegrate. German commanders attempted to negotiate local surrenders in order to save their soldiers and civilians from further destruction. On May 7th, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces. The following day, May 8th, became known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Across Europe and North America, crowds filled the streets celebrating the end of the war on the continent. After nearly 6 years of conflict, Nazi Germany had finally been defeated. But the Second World War was not yet completely over. In the Pacific, the war between the United States and Japan continued with brutal intensity. American forces had begun advancing across the Pacific Islands, capturing territory step by step in a campaign known as island hopping. Each battle was costly, and Japanese forces fought fiercely to defend their positions. By the summer of 1945, American bombers were conducting massive air raids over Japanese cities. Yet the Japanese government still had not surrendered. In August 1945, the United States introduced a new and devastating weapon. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The explosions destroyed large portions of both cities and caused enormous loss of life. Facing the reality of total destruction, Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. With that decision, the Second World War finally came to an end. The cost of the conflict was staggering. More than 60 million people had died. Entire cities had been destroyed, economies shattered, and millions of families displaced across continents. The war reshaped the global balance of power. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers, beginning a new era of geopolitical tension known as the Cold War. Out of the devastation, the international community also began building new institutions designed to prevent future global conflicts. One of these organizations, the United Nations, was created to encourage cooperation and diplomacy among nations. The Second World War remains the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. Its lessons continue to influence international politics, military strategy, and global relations even decades later. The war had ended, but the world it created would never be the same.